All right. And happy today to have Jared Miller with us. He's going to be talking about soil maps for production agriculture. Would also like to thank our sponsors before Jared gets started this morning, the sponsors for the Women in Agriculture program, as well as the collaborators on the program. And we do have our Women in Ag conference coming up February 13th, so we're beginning to make plans for that. So anyone that has attended that in the past, that'll be in Dover, Delaware, February 13th at 2019 already. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Jared.
All right, thank you, Shannon. Okay. All right, we good? You can see it?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to talk about soil maps, how you can use soil maps and look at them for precision agriculture. Let me make sure I've got the chat box open in case someone's got a question. I don't know why, Shannon, it likes to close it so you can't see it.
Yeah, I can help manage that, Jared. If you want to go ahead and
tell me if there's
a question.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So soil mapping actually is at this point over 100 years old. Soils were originally recognized by geologists as important, probably in the late 1800s. So the U.S. had a division of soils about 1890, which became the Federal Bureau of Soils. So they were the first guys that realized that we need to go out and dig holes in the ground and keep track of this as a natural resource. The Soil Conservation Service, which eventually became what we know as the NRCS, started in the 30s to combat soil erosion in the Dust Bowl. They eventually took over a lot of the mapping duties. There was, if you go back and read some of the history, there were some battles between agencies of how to map and who should be mapping and how to name. But it's come up with the product we have today. So the NRCS was renamed in 1994. So you can see if you find an old copy of a soil map book, you will, for each county, you'll see that they used to be mapped with, like ours, the Maryland Ag Experiment Station. So University of Maryland worked with soil conservation in the past to make a lot of these maps. So the first surveys were right about 1899 to 1900, and in fact, one Maryland county, Cecil County, was one of the first ones mapped along with two others. One of the first soil series ever named was actually the Cecil soil type. Eventually, they decided that the Cecil would be named after the warmer version of it down south, so you can't even find the Cecil soil in Cecil County, although it was originally mapped there. These surveys were done by people walking across fields with augers, digging holes in the ground, marking them, and going back and then drawing in their lines. It became a lot easier with aerial photography later on with airplanes, say in the 20s and 30s, to draw these boundaries over top of maps. And when you would open up these books, they would have a lot of different information that was written by these guys that walked the county. I mean, acre to acre across the entire county. Over a couple years, they walked these fields. They knew the farmers. They knew the people that worked there. They knew the land. And so when you read their description of the soil types, like on the right there from the, I think that was from Worcester County's, the Othello Soil Series, they have a description in there to tell you, you know, this is how they saw the soil. So this was a really good resource if you're interested in ag, so that you could go through there and look at soils as a resource. They weren't just meant for agriculture, although a lot of soil maps are aimed that way. There's a lot of information in there related to engineering principles down the road, like where you can put in lagoons and where you can put in septic drainage fields. So these guys would walk the fields, they dig a hole, and then they would make a map. So they describe these soils, they categorize and try to group soils that were similar and then give them a name. And the thing is, you might find a soil survey from 1920 that's going to have names that we don't even have anymore. And it's going to have things that we don't necessarily use anymore. So these names can change. Of course, the soil properties haven't, and they still rename and regroup some of these soils today. So while I will talk about going back and looking at the old soil surveys for information, you have to be careful, because sometimes they'll decide that the soil that they named it back in 1970 is not currently what they think it is anymore, and they'll give it a new name. But what never really changes is the soil properties. So you can always go up and look at the soil properties. So I had a couple friends that got to do this right before they switched over and started digitizing this stuff. So soil maps and names, it's very important because a lot of people, they just go by the name of their soil type, which can be useful if you get used to the soil you have and if they don't change the name and if you're talking to farmers in your area. But it's really a lot of the soil properties are actually more important sometimes. So you got to dig into what the soil actually is. So you see on the right there we have the state soil of Maryland, which is the sassafras, and then another one that's in the same region as the sassafras. You can see it's a much different soil type, the Othello. So soils were mapped based on their genetic characteristics, which basically means how they were formed. These guys dig a hole, they describe the horizons, they describe the properties, and then they get out and debate with each other over what it should be named and how it should be grouped. It doesn't mean the name relates to what you can do with it. Someone who's used to the sassafras soil knows that it's a good soil for farming, but you can do a lot more with it than just that. And just as they would know that the Othello soil type, while good for farming, is a little wetter. So you have to know what you can do with the soil. You don't just go by the name because everybody could find a different use for those soil types. This is a very old map that I found recently from the 1907 Federal Bureau of Soils of Maryland, and you can see all those different soil types that they mapped and grouped together actually are really following the geology because we hadn't dug that many holes in 1907, and we didn't really understand soils like we do back then. So they actually worked with the Maryland Geological Survey and came up with this map of geological formations and ag soils. So this is a very old system that we've been doing. We've been doing and mapping soils for a long time. We've just gotten better at describing their properties. Here is 1909, the first national soils map. Again, if you look at it, it's very general, and it's basically following the geology of the country. So it's not going to be something that's very in-depth, and of course, when you get to the scale, when you get to a nationwide scale, it's hard to be in-depth. Here was 1931. You can see a lot of the river and stream channels down there on the right. You can see all the geology across the country, and it's probably a lot of climate in there as well, where the climate changes as we go across the country, and you get less rainfall and but still maintain some of those warmer temperatures like out in the desert. So they had a lot more detail when you get towards 1931. Here's 1938 where they start putting in the county boundaries. More detail again, still basically following the geology because it's hard to separate out at this scale the geologic factors or the difference between all the soil types. This is one that I use in a lot of presentations because it's very basic. 2008, it's actually from Encyclopedia Britannica, but they have maps of what we eventually called the soil orders, the different soil types. And what I like about this one in class is so you can see across the country and understand how different all these soils are and how when you go across country, it's kind of connected to two things. One in the southeast, and in our region, you see the orange soil, that's the ultimate soil, ultisol, which means ultimate weathering. They're very highly weathered soils because of our temperature and rainfall. And as you move west, we get those darker soils that you're used to seeing in the Corn Belt, the mollisols, the things with the dark, high organic matter surface horizons. And then you get out towards the desert area, like Las Vegas and Nevada, and you see the iridosols, where the desert soils are. So come back to the east and look at the ultisols, look at that orange there, and you will see this strip of green going down the middle where we have the alpha sols. That's the limestone valley. If you're used to being out towards Hagerstown, the limestone that's out under some of their soils and going all the way down to the southeast. So in one hand, you can see where climate and rainfall affect the soils that form there, and on the other, you can see how that parent material, that rock type, really shapes a lot of the soils across the country on a large scale. You are probably used to dealing with, if you look at your property, a much finer scale in your soils because the closer we get to state level and county level, the more detail we can put in. So there's a map of Delaware soils in that region. So the whole region is mapped as ultisols and entisols on the 2008 map. But if you look at a state level, we can put a lot more detail in. But they're still just associations. If you take from Sussex County, Delaware, and the region close to where our research station is, you can take a look at how detailed these soil surveys actually are, and I will still tell you that it is not that accurate. Even those lines across that region, the soils change immensely. They can change a lot from foot to foot, inch to inch, depending on what you want to do with it. Say you want to build a house, it might not matter so much if your cation exchange capacity might change or your organic matter content might change. But if you're in agriculture, those small differences can make a big change in the kind of yield you can pull off. So these actual soil surveys had a lot more detail, and all these lines had been drawn in by hand. So NRCS, eventually, back about when I was finishing college, some of my friends got to do this. They went in and scanned in the old soil surveys. So every single paper survey that was in existence, and I have a collection of almost all the counties from Maryland, every single paper survey was scanned into a PDF. So if you want to read what was written about Dorchester County in 1926, it is online and you can find it. You can see the last time they did a paper survey for Dorchester was 1998, which is pretty recent for some of these surveys that we have. So for Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, you can find your old county survey and actually read it online if you can't find a paper copy anymore. And the reason I like to encourage people to look it up or have a copy, particularly if it's in your county, is because of the soil scientists that work that region. They wrote things that they're almost lost anymore. We don't keep track of it. We don't have people that look at the soils like we used to. Because we've mapped this as a resource, we're not going to pay hundreds and thousands of people to walk across the land and remap all these soils like we did. So you lose the men and women that walked across this landscape and really understood what was on a countywide basis, and we have to search out this information. So if you take a look at the Harford County Soil Survey, which was last done in 1975, and you always want to look at that year because that's the last time somebody wrote anything like this about soils. If you look up your soil type, you might find a description within the county where this soil scientist has written in, let's look at the third paragraph in here. Brandywine soils are easy to work, but the hard angular gravel is abrasive to most farm implements. You're not going to find that kind of information anywhere else if you don't understand your soil. These soils are moderately rapidly permeable and have a low available water capacity. All kinds of information for farmers written right there so you can get an idea of how is this soil different from another soil. If you have worked your land for 20 years, you probably know a lot of this. But if you're going to buy land or discuss with somebody about some property you're renting, these descriptions might have a little bit more information to give you an idea of what you're getting into besides looking at the actual properties of the soil. So if you don't understand soils that well, they kind of give a nice short description of how they view the soil in terms of agriculture. And you're only going to find this in these old paper copies or the scanned-in copies. They also, this is something that I always liked about soils, was how they formed. Again, this is probably something that's a little more important to me than other people. But there are 5 factors of soil formation. If you've ever taken a soils class, I'm sure you got it drilled into your head. Parent material is one of them. And what I like about these old surveys is someone asks me to look at their county or work in their county. I pull it up because the same thing, the soil scientists understood how the soil is formed from walking across all that acreage, and they write a nice description that lets me very quickly get to know what kind of soils am I dealing with. So in Harford County, you can see in the second paragraph they wrote these are residuum. This is where you can get into an issue if you don't understand the terminology. So this paragraph doesn't quite help people as much if you don't have the background. But residuum means soils formed from bedrock in place. So you have soils that formed from rocks weathering in place. And then that sentence says, material consisting of sand, silt, clay, and fragments of rocks transported by water, which means coastal plain. So part of Harford County is actually going to be similar to the eastern shore of Maryland and where we are in Delaware in terms of their soil types. So if you read through this, they kind of give you an idea of what is the underlying parent material so you don't have to go and look up a geology map if you're interested in what kind of rocks do my soils form from. Again, I love this stuff, and maybe some people don't find it so interesting. You can always just pay attention to the actual soil properties. Another thing they had in a lot of these surveys, which I love to look at, and they didn't have them for all soil types, is they would take the names of the soils they had, and they would draw maps. They would draw diagrams that kind of showed, here's how they're associated together in the landscape. So again, this is from Harford County, and you can see on the left side of this diagram, underneath there, it says crystalline rock. So all those soils on the left side are forming directly from bedrock. As you go to the right, they're showing where all the sediments form, just like where we are on the eastern shore, and those soils are forming from eroded sediments that came off of other areas. So I liked these drawings, and I like to put them in presentations if they're still updated, because again, this is from 1975. No one's going to draw this again. No one's going to update it that I know of. And if the names have changed, it might not match the soil you're looking at. In some cases, a lot of these soils in Hartford still are mapped this way, so it can be useful, but you have to be careful with that. But you can see how the Chester is on the upslope and the Manor is on the side slope, and the Glenelg is down there in the bottom where the floodplain is on these rivers. So it kind of gives you an idea, not very quickly, of, well, these are the differences in these names of these soils that I'm looking at and how it might relate to what you're going to do with it in production ag. They also had tables of site suitability ratings. All of this is online now, but in the back they had table after table that would let you know if you wanted in the Aldino with an A slope, if you wanted to put in sewage disposal filter fields, it had severe problems because of slope permeability and a seasonally perched water table. So if you're looking at buying some land and you want to know ahead of time what that soil might perk, all of that was in here. It doesn't mean you couldn't find a spot somewhere where it would perk. It just means that in that map unit, you're more than likely going to have an issue. So it's a good way to look at land before you rent or buy it. Of course, all this stuff, like I said, I'll show you, is now online. The site suitability ratings can be found online. There's another thing I always think you should check that would help you with looking at soil types. Unfortunately, again, they're written for soil scientists and not for the layman, but you can find information in them. And these are the official series descriptions. So if you come back to these names, the Brandywine series, which is written, I think, more for people about here's what you can do with the soil. You can read that. Of course, like I said, this is from 1975 versus the official series descriptions, which are updated. But they're not written for laymen. You have to know how to find the information. But if you want to know a description of your soils, you just type in official series descriptions or OSD in Google. Go to this web page that's on the left, and you type in your soil. So the Quepanco is the soil that's down here on the lower eastern shore. You'll see two things you can click on. One, the link to the description, which I have the arrow in black, so you can get the description and read about the properties of that soil very quickly. Or you can click the extent map and see where else is it mapped. And I like to do this because it shows you how these soil scientists were thinking. There's quite a bit of this mapped in Somerset County and then a little bit up there in Delaware, but they wasn't mapped in other spots. So it gets you an idea of how they look at the soil series and where it was mapped. The official series description has a lot of words that you do not need to know. You can skip most of it unless you're actually trained in reading it. It won't directly apply to what you might want to do with it for agriculture. It's more about how they separate out these horizons. On the left side, you'll see all the horizon names, AP, BTG. Again, you can skip that if you don't understand it. There's two things I think that help you, is the color and then the texture. So without having to dig a hole, you can get an idea as you go down to the soil that it has very dark grayish brown colors. This is the Falsington series. And it's gray down all the way through, which to me as a soil scientist means this is a wetter soil with those colors. And then you can see those textures. Well, you might only know the sandy loam surface. A 10-inch surface might be where you're taking your soil samples or where you're growing your crops. You can now see without digging a hole that, in general, the soil should increase in clay content. It goes from sandy loam to a sandy clay loam. By the time you get down there to 40 to 70 inches, it goes back to a sandy texture. So if you look up the OSD, you can skip a lot of information and just say, well, what are these textures as you go down through my soil? So what the NRCS eventually did, it digitized all those soil maps. So they scanned in the old paper copies and they put the maps online so you can access them very quickly. Web Soil Survey was something that we've used quite a bit. I find it to be a little bit harder if you haven't used it in the first place. So we're going to start with UC Davis Soil Web and then get back into Web Soil Survey. UC Davis Soil Web is something you can pull up on your laptop, your tablet, or your cell phone. If you're standing out in the field, on your farm, in your garden, wherever you're at, with your cell phone, and you go to UC Davis Soil Web, and you click, you see those buttons down there, you can click that little image there underneath the menu. It will zoom to your location where you're standing. Or you can go to Zoom to Location, and you can type in an address, and it will take you to that location. And once you do that, you can click on all the soils that are in that area and actually look at their descriptions that way. So UC Davis Soil Web, if you've never used or looked at a soil map, it's the easiest thing to start with. You can pull it up on anything, and it's very user-friendly. It just doesn't have as much of some of the information that I'll show you that you can get off of Web Soil Survey. So the first thing you'll want to do is click on a region. This is over near Cambridge, near Horn Point. So I click on this soil, say that's a field I'm interested in, and it pulls up that here are the soils that are grouped together. So you can see it says 48% Othello and 27% of that area is Othello. I don't know why. I didn't write this. I'm not sure why it says that, but you'll see that quite a bit. They also estimate that about 10% and 5% are other soils, but mostly the soil should be Othello. So that tells you what I said about these maps not being extremely accurate. They know that there's different soils within this association, but it's easier to just map it as all as one. So the Othello, you can then click on the name of the soil. You can see it's in blue, and then it brings you up this image, and you can see the colors. Every time this does not work. Sometimes you will get no color in there. But if you understand soil colors, and typically what I tell people is if you see gray colors, it's wet. If you see brown colors, it's dry. That's the easiest way to look at these different soils. Now, you can stand out in the field, if you have good service, click on where you're at, and see the soil that's beneath your feet without digging a hole. Now, does it mean that every single horizon is this thick across there? No. This is just a general idea of what's underneath your feet. But now you have an idea without looking, or if you're talking to somebody or consulting with somebody, now you have an idea of what they're going to deal with if they want to use this land for anything, from production ag all the way up to if they want to build a house for a septic drainage field. Other information that's on there, so you can see we were looking at the typical profile, but under typical profile you can also click on things like clay, and then you'll get this graph. So now it's giving you an estimate. As you go down, you can see on the bottom it says clay percentage increases as you go to the right. So as you go down, you see this bulge. As you get to about 50 centimeters deep, you have maximum clay content, and then it backs off again. So if you were to look at the Othello official series description, and if you look above that graph, if you look at where the official series description is, you don't even have to look up the OSD. It's right here. You click on that, and it will bring up the same thing I showed you before. And you should see the textures match where that clay content rises and falls. But you can also click on sand and KSAT and pH. These are not meant to be research grade numbers. They're meant to be guidance for you as to what your soil properties might be underneath your feet. It also has a lot of this land classification information, like capability class and wind erodibility group. They have question marks next to them that can help describe what they are and how you would use them. But it also has some of the other interesting stuff that I liked. Like, I understand that silty aeolian deposits is wind over fluvial-marine sediments over water deposits. So sometimes parent material makes sense. If you know the terminology, you might have to look it up. But I like information like that. It lets me know a little more about the soil when I talk to people. And then those suitability ratings I talked about are at the bottom. Engineering, irrigation. So this soil, the Othello, is very limited for excavated ponds, somewhat limited for embankments. Does that tell you how you can do it or what you can do with it? No, it just gives you a general idea. This is better for if you're planning something, if you're going to rent land, you're going to buy land. It gives you an indication of where you might be limited to start out with. So you can also use Web Soil Survey for agriculture. This one is a little harder, so I'll go through it by step. You'll probably, if you're using this for land, what I'm going to show you, you're only going to do 1 or 2 times. You're not going to have to do this every day, so it doesn't hurt to try it. I think that UC Davis is easier to use every single day, wherever you're at, if you're talking to people, if you're consulting, if you're looking at land. Web Soil Survey is great if you want to make a really good map of some kind of properties going across the land that you're working on. So the first thing you do when you go to Web Soil Survey is you're going to go up and you'll see Area of Interest. You have to select the area you're interested in. I usually click on State and County because it's the easiest to pick. So then I chose Delaware, and then I chose Sussex County. And as soon as you hit the View button, it brings you right to Sussex County. The other thing you have to do after that is zoom further. A lot of times you can't make a map at this scale. It's too much detail. So up there in that red box, you'll see the plus symbol, and you see the area of interest symbol. So you're going to zoom in to a location you're interested in. So I choose, again, somewhere near the research station. So I zoomed in to this area where the map's in, and then I used the AOI box, and these striped lines you see here are actually the area of interest. So you draw that red box around the area you want to know. Is it your farm? Is it a neighboring farm? Is it some land you're going to consult for? So after you do that, they don't give you the soil map because you're still on the area of interest page. You have to go up to the top and click soil map. And sometimes that's what confuses people the first time. You click soil map, and now you have the same soil map you get at UC Davis, but it took more work to get there. And the payoff for it, the reason you want to do this is the type of maps you can make. All the same information is here, the soil types, the descriptions. But what I like about Web Soil Survey is the fact that you can actually make a map of these properties. You don't have to look at it one soil at a time. You can take a look across the whole map itself and see how do these soils relate to each other. To do that, you go off the soil map and you click the next tab, Soil Data Explorer. And we're just going to go to Vegetative Productivity because we're looking at crops. Under Suitabilities and Limitation Ratings, so you click Soil Data Explorer, you don't have Intro to Soils, then you click Suitabilities and Limitations for Use tab, then you come down to Vegetative Productivity. Under Vegetative Productivity, you're going to get a full list of things, and depending on your soil and your map, some of these will be there, some of them won't. Sometimes you'll click on these and there'll be no data. It's just how it is. Again, I didn't create this. I couldn't tell you every single reason why some things are in there or not, but that's the way it is. Typically, I'm interested in yields of crops. So here we're going to have some irrigation in Delaware. So you can do yields of irrigated crops or yields of non-irrigated crops. In this case, when I tried it on my map, only the component function worked. I'm not always as interested in the specifics of it, of why one works over the other. You just want a map, so you pick what works. Yields of irrigated crops, I typically leave it as it is. I chose corn as a crop. You click View Rating, and now you've gone from just having a map of soil types and names to actually a suitability rating for how well it might grow different crops. So now across this whole region, again, you've worked here 20 years on your land, you already know this, but if you're going to consult with somebody, buy new land, now you can kind of get an idea of how a soil scientist thinks this land might work for production ag. These lines don't mean anything if you don't click on the legend. The legend doesn't come up right away. Up in that left-hand corner, where I have that red arrow, you see that legend tab. So you click on that, and it's going to give you a legend. Just look for the colors. There's a lot of information in there, but look for the colors. And this is going to be in bushels per acre. So that red area, which you can tell if you know, is going to be some kind of floodplain. It's going to be stream, the way those lines are. They estimate that you'd get less than 11 bushels per acre if you tried to grow corn there. While up to those blue areas, you could get 126 or 155. Now, these numbers might be from the 90s. They probably haven't been updated. That doesn't mean you're not going to get greater than that. It doesn't mean you can't manage the soil to get 300 bushels. So these numbers are not to be limitations. You have to look at them as a comparison. As you walk across this land, where do you think you might have high productivity versus low productivity? And then you start thinking about management. Do I need to lime this land? Do I need more fertilizer? Do I need cover crops and building organic matter? Management is up to you, but at least you get an idea of where your higher or lower productive soils might be. Don't say, oh, okay, I'm only going to max out at 155. That's not true. In most cases, you can probably do better than that. You can also do much worse than that if you don't manage it well. The other nice thing about this is you can print them. So you could have a printed map in a book next to your desk if you're trying to remember as you go across these soils what soils are similar to each other. So if you don't understand all the names, and you can see this HUA, HUA, some of these are just different slope classes. They're actually the same soil type. So you can see that all this green through here is the same. But then these other soil types are a little bit different. So this map provides you with an easy way to look at what they think the productivity might be, and then you can compare it. So you might have a yield map. You can start comparing what they think the productivity is to what you're getting out of these soil types and see how close they are. The other thing you can do, there's another one I like to make, is soil properties and qualities. So we were under suitabilities and limitations for use. That's where yield was. Soil properties would let you map like clay content or cation exchange capacity, or under soil health, organic matter, which is another nice map to have. So under soil organic matter, the same thing. I just click on view rating. I don't change anything, leave it as it is. And now you see almost an opposite pattern. But again, where's your soil organic matter the highest? It's in those floodplains. And where is it lower? Up in these areas that were actually had a little bit better productivity. But as you get away from the stream, you really pick up in organic matter content somewhat. So if you compare soil yields versus organic matter, this is the great thing about these maps. If you make a couple, if you save them, if you print them off, you can start to look at the differences in these soil types and the organic matter content. Does this mean that this is exactly what the organic matter content is across this region? No, it changes a lot across here. But again, it's a general guide, and it's based off numbers that they took at one point. If you've been doing no-till, if you've been doing cover crops, perhaps you've raised the organic matter content of some of these fields beyond what they were in the first place. But you can see that floodplains have the highest organic matter, but also the lowest yields because they're too wet. So it kind of gives you an idea of these associations between soil type and yield and properties. So if you understand a little bit about soils, you can actually get into some of this information and do some comparisons. These maps are not meant for precision agriculture. This is UC Davis Soil Web's map. For this region, this was a soybean field that we were having some issues with, and when we took a drone up and took a shot of it, you can see that the soil type changes drastically compared to what UC Davis Soil Web is. And now remember that I forgot to go back and scan in the old map. That's why there's a blank here. But under this blank map, the paper survey from Sussex County, they actually had these lines were actually in here. Somebody had mapped and described some of the soil type. But at some point when they digitized it, someone went through and decided that no, this soil would all be grouped together and we would separate out the lines for whatever reason. So sometimes it's good to actually have the old paper survey. You can't see it here, but some of these lines were actually in there. So, but you cannot get the maps for the paper surveys were not scanned. You have to actually have a copy in your hand. You have to understand the limits of these soil series. So that map is useful at knowing general properties, but these names are based on, like I said before, genetic characteristics of formation, not what you can do with them. So it's always a good idea to delve in the actual properties of these soils. So for one, here's one soil type where I looked at the extent map. Someone really liked this soil name in one county. Over there in Virginia, somebody mapped a lot of the soil there, a little bit in D.C., a little bit in Baltimore, a little in Harford County, and a little just west of Philly. But they didn't, it wasn't mapped everywhere because every county was mapped by somebody else. So the name of the soil is useful in your region if you know it. But as you go state to state and county to county, you might have the same soil type under a different name. I really like this one because this soil type predicted a political boundary before it existed between Pennsylvania and Baltimore County. But apparently whoever mapped Harford County found that that soil name fit soils there, but whoever mapped Baltimore County didn't. I don't know why. A lot of these soil scientists are the ones that made me want to be get into soils, these mappers, and they can be a very interesting bunch, and they can get very vociferous when they're defending how they map their soils. But this is why you kind of ignore a name, because the soil does not stop at the border of Pennsylvania and Baltimore County. The soil is going to go across this border, but it has a different name. So you don't rely on the name, you look at the properties. So looking at the name and the horizon, the texture, the color, the thickness, the root limiting layers you might find, the drainage class, and the land capability class can all help you understand what your soil is and understand what your neighbor's soil is. So if you have different named soils or someone lists a soil that they have, don't go by the name, look up the properties, and then you can start to figure out how it might work for you. So we come back to this. The Faldington, whatever is mapped across those borders, probably has a similar description, and then you can look and compare them and say, okay, these textures are the same as I go down, the horizon names are the same, and the colors are the same. It's the same soil. Soils with different names can produce the same. Soils with the same name might actually have different production depending on the variability across there. Horizons do a lot to affect plant growth. So although you might not understand every single designation from A, E, B, and C, for those horizons, understand that there is a difference for plant productivity. Not every time. Some of those BT1 and BT2 might produce the exact same kind of properties that your plant root might see, but that's why you want to look at what's the clay content, what's the sand content. So I like to give a quick rundown of what some of these letters can mean so you can quickly look at these without being an expert for all these different soil types. If you just look at, and a lot of times I just tell people just ignore that E horizon, it's fine if you ignore it. A, B, and C, A is always at the surface. B is something that's probably going to have, it particularly has a T, more clay, more water and nutrient holding, but B is basically very weathered parent material, while C is something that's not weathered. So you can see the soil on the right. If you look at the bottom where the C horizon is, you see how smooth that is? It kind of looks like rock. That's because that C horizon is basically very soft rock. That's all it is. And what happened to the B is it used to be soft rock, but it's so much older and more weathered, it turned into what we recognize more as soil. It has that texture and has the structure. The A horizon is at the top of the organic matter, but leaching and rainfall moved clay down into the B. So the B actually probably has higher clay than the A and C, and that's where that bulge comes from that you saw before. So if you remember that the C horizon is young, unweathered parent material, that the B means the soil is older and the A is at the surface, that gives you a rough idea of how to look at some of these horizons. Two of the sub-letters, the smaller letters, the suffix you'll see with A horizons include a P, which means it's plowed. The reason I talk about plowed is if a soil scientist put AP on a soil, that tells you that somebody plowed it at some point, and it must be a good soil for agriculture, like this one here has a nice plow in it. AP. The AG, that G means gray. It means clay, but I just tell people gray because it's easy to remember. That tells you water saturation. If you have an AG, you're probably not going to be farming it. Same thing with B's. There's a bunch of letters, but if you know these four in the Mid-Atlantic, it probably tells you enough about what you want to know. A BW actually means it's still close to a C horizon. It's young. It hasn't formed very well. It might have a little bit of changes, but it's still pretty similar to the C. So if you have a BW, it might mean you have a young soil that hasn't released a lot of nutrients or doesn't have a lot of clay. It could mean that. The BG, just like the A, means gray. So you see that BG up in the corner. If you see a G, that means it was wet at some point. Someone could have put in drainage tile and pulled the water off, but that means that's a wet soil. BX is important. Actually, Kent County, Maryland has quite a few layers like this. It's a pan layer. It's dense, and it's going to be root limiting, and it's going to be water limiting. So these pictures are actually from Kentucky. There's quite a bit of these BX horizons out there. In Maryland, we have them where you have silt overlying certain materials. So the eastern shore of Maryland along the bay side actually has quite a bit of these BX horizons. And then that BT is the one you're going to see the most of. It means clay accumulation. It means that B horizon builds up in clay. It doesn't tell you how much, though. That's why you got to go back and look at texture, because T just means they saw increase in clay. It could be 1%, it could be 20%. That makes a difference in the soil properties. So if you look at the sassafras, there's that AP. They've called it, if you were to look at the sassafras profile and you see Soil Davis, you'll see the colors, you'll see AP, and then if you look at an image they took, there's your plow layer. There's where the plow went through. So that tells you if it was plowed at some point, someone found a good soil for agriculture. Then you get down to the BTs. You see a little bit of difference in color, but it's essentially the same horizon. That T tells you there's more clay. How much? I don't know without checking the texture. Or clicking on clay over here. You don't know. You just know if someone said, hey, I've got a BT horizon that has more clay than what was above it. And then C, we get into that sand. It backs off. It's the original parent material that was laid down. Versus the Othello, where they have a darkened A over here, but then you see that BTG. So it has more clay than above it, but it's also gray, and you can see from the colors. It's shown up. And this actually has silt over top of sand, and that's what that 2 means over there. So you're not going to understand every single letter. I wouldn't worry if you see BTG 1 through 3. You could assume it's all similar enough in terms of agriculture. I think I need to talk about that one. But land capability classes, I mentioned, if you look at UC Davis at the top, some of those soil images and descriptions of the soils, they'll give you a land capability class. So these are helpful with agriculture too, because class 1 through 4 typically you can grow crops on them. Class 5 through 8, you're starting to get into pasture, only for pasture, up to only for recreational purposes. So I left this slide up here. You don't have to memorize it. You can find this online. You can look this stuff up. One is going to have some slight limitations that restrict use for agriculture and plant growth. You don't find those very often. We usually have class 2, moderate limitations. 3 have severe. Say you have to add drainage to that soil, and class 4 would have very severe, but you could still grow if you were good at managing. By the time you get to class 5, you should only be in pasture. So here's a class 1, it's a very good soil, probably something out from the Midwest. Widest range of possible land uses. This is from an NRCS calendar that they sent me a couple years ago. Typically not very limited. You don't find a lot of those around here. Class 2 limitations, they start putting these subletters on there, so it lets you know why they think it's limited. So E is for erosion, and W is for water. S is for rooting zone, like it might have that BX horizon, and then C is for climatic conditions, like possibly a desert. So this class 2 soil, at the surface, perfectly fine for growing. As you get to the bottom, do you see those gray colors coming in there? There's where your water saturation sits. So they have this as a class 2W. You can grow crops on it, but maybe if you have 5 inches of rainfall, it's going to be a lot more difficult to work with the soil, or if you have a hurricane coming, it's going to be a lot difficult to work with the soil in the spring, and maybe even get equipment on in the fall. But you can still grow things with management. I'm going to go all the way to class 8 so you understand what they mean, best for forest recreation or environmental protection. It's going to be a park. It possibly could be logged, but more than likely, if you look at that soil over there on the left with those rocks sitting there and a very thin surface horizon of soil, it needs to be left alone. It needs to just be left in its natural state to erode and work as it will, because as soon as you do anything with it, it's going to be very destructive to that soil type. This is a map across the country that lets you get an idea of land capability class and how they've mapped them. So you know across this region that not every single one of these soils produces the same. But across most of the Mid-Atlantic, we have very productive soils, 1s or 2s. It's only when you get into wetter spots or in the Appalachians that you start to get into those very restrictive soil types. But across most of the eastern half of the country, we have very productive soil. So when you see land capability class, more than likely in this area, for your soil, it's going to be a 2. And it's going to have a letter on it. And like where we're at on the peninsula over here, it's probably going to say W. But if you're over towards the other parts of Maryland, you're in the rolling hills, you might have an E on there for erosion. So when you want to use soil maps for production agriculture, you don't want to just rely on the name. You want to look at all those properties. What's the texture? What's the color? How deep? Where do things change? Instead of just looking at the name. So when people start talking about sassafras or Othello or Fallsington or Glenelg or any of these other soil types, don't just go by the name. Go look up that OSD, go on UC Davis, dig down in, look at the clay contents, and realize what's going on underneath your feet. I think that UC Davis Soil Web is the best for quick views. I tell people when giving presentations, they can pull out their phones and look right then. It doesn't bother me. When you can walk anywhere and we'll zoom to your location, so it's great for working out in the fields. Web Soil Survey, though, although you can see it takes a lot more steps and it might be a little bit of a pain, you're not going to try to use it every day. You can make maps of yield, organic matter, and clay content as long as you understand they're not extremely accurate. But it's a map that you can use and you can compare to. Let's say if you get a yield map off your land and you can start to decide, am I going to sample differently? Should I put fields in different spots? What am I going to do with this land? Maybe that map helps give you an idea of where to concentrate. Maybe take soil samples in a different part of the field, and because you're going to apply a different amount of nutrients there, try to increase your yield. So Web Soil Survey, yes. Does it take more time? Absolutely. Are you going to make yield maps every day? No. You'll probably do it one time. The official series descriptions, those OSDs, they're dense. There's information you don't need, but if you just look at the textures and the colors, you look at those descriptions, it'll tell you where it was mapped, what the parent material is, how they think it formed. There is information there. And the last thing you don't have to do, but if you like soils as much as I do, I recommend downloading your old county soil survey from any of the years it's up there and read what these soil scientists wrote about your county, about the soils and how they worked, where they came from, how they got there. It will open up your eyes to the land around you without you having to call on a soil scientist to figure it out. And there's not as many of us out there doing this like there were 20 years ago that had this kind of knowledge. So you want to keep these soil surveys around. All right. I think I'm right on time. So I guess, Shannon, if you want to go to questions, if there are any.
Sure. Any questions for Jared? That was very interesting, Jared. I appreciate you sharing all the resources that are available there, and then, you know, what to pick out. There's so much information.
There is some of these companies that are selling their programs. I think you're going to see more and more soil maps in your hand that's not UC Davis, where you're going to be able to overlay your yield maps with soil maps. But right now, those are the things that are easiest to use.
And so I see a couple of people putting a question. Yes, if you can write that question into the text box, that would be great. Good question. We are recording this, and so if you've registered in Eventbrite, you will be receiving the link to this recording, as well as a copy of Jared's slides will be posted online as well. So there will be a recording. It'll be located at this blue web link here that's bolded. So there's a question about any plans to do more soil surveys in the future. There aren't any plans to do more soil surveys in the future.
You know, that's a good question for the NRCS. If there is something that they haven't mapped, and I haven't double-checked to make sure every area was mapped, what they do is they update them. They do update these surveys. They still do research and some data. But a lot of my friends that used to do this have moved into other positions within NRCS. So there's not going to be any new soil survey, and there's no reason to map whole county again because we've done it once. But they will be updated if they have new information or they think they see something different they need to separate out. They do update them. And that's why you use UC Davis, we use Web Soil Survey to see if they've changed anything. But there might be some counties out there, areas that they haven't been able to spend time on, but I don't know anybody that's really doing a full soil survey. And if you mean publishing or printing them, no, you're not going to get those at all.
So now that they're digitized and they did that the last big overhaul, they'll just be doing updates.
Yes, I think they'll just update the online maps and the Surgo database. I had friends that were, you know, they were gathering more data for the NRCS, like they would go across these areas and find soil organic matter at certain levels, like they're interested in soil health now. They're probably going to do work like that, but not necessarily a completely new survey.
Okay.
The soil survey that was conducted 10 years ago is as reliable as it ever was in terms of a general resource. It's always a starting point. You use a soil survey. To me, the biggest use in which you guys can do to help is spreading the word to all of the people you know that don't use them. If they're going to buy land, if they're going to rent land, you want to look at the survey first because it's got that information. Then you go out there and find more detail because they're not highly detailed. I can take a yield map over top of the soil survey and it will show you a lot of differences that aren't there. But I would say they are absolutely reliable as a general resource.
Okay, there's another question, Jared, about what is a reasonable amount of permeability tests done over certain acreage as further testing for farmland production?
What was that one again?
It's a reasonable amount of permeability tests done over certain acreage for further testing for farmland production.
I don't know if they mean specifically doing more tests, like a perk test on the surface, or doing infiltration, because that can change a lot with the practices you use. You know, certainly the subsurface horizons that they know are there are going to be accurate enough, but the surface horizons are going to change based on tillage and practices every year.
those that were, hopefully that answered your question. If you have any other details or maybe more specific, if you're looking for types of permeability tests or how many actual tests that you try to do over acreage.
I mean, for me, if I was looking at over acreage, if you have a knowledge of the landscape, it's just like when I tell people a soil sample. I'd concentrate on where I know things are bad versus good. If the soil landscape looks similar enough, then that infiltration rate probably works, maybe the conductivity. But if you see regions that don't match the soil map, that's where you want to go check them. Like that image I showed you before, that that with a drone now, during the growing season, we can see soil types. The same thing that farmers are seeing with their yield maps. You can see differences in soils that aren't in a map because somebody was walking 300 acres a day and digging holes to give us a general resource. Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right, any other questions for Jared? Great. Well, Jared, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we'll be sending the link out probably within the next day or two.
Okay, all right.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.